In a federal courtroom, Judge Amy Coney Barrett slammed her gavel and spat, "You disgrace this institution." But Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She smiled. What followed wasn't a shouting match. It was a surgical takedown that left a Supreme Court justice exposed on live TV. When justice wears a robe, who judges the judge? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The room was packed tighter than a State of the Union address. Every seat filled, every aisle lined with reporters, clerks, students, and observers who understood they weren't just witnessing a legal proceeding, they were about to watch a moment that could tilt history. Cameras, though barred from the courtroom, were practically replicated by the number of smartphones clutched outside in the hallway, waiting for any leak. At the front of the room, high atop the bench, sat Justice Amy Coney Barrett in her robe, posture rigid, gaze icy. Below her, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood, cool and unmoved, dressed in burgundy as if daring the room to underestimate her before she spoke a single word. She wasn't just present, she was prepared. But what no one expected was how quickly the proceedings would veer from constitutional arguments into something far more volatile. Justice Barrett didn't wait for formalities. Her gavel hadn't yet hit wood. She leaned slightly forward, her voice sharp and cutting. "Congresswoman Crockett, your contempt for this institution is appalling." The sentence landed like a slap across the room. The entire gallery stilled. Some thought they'd misheard. Others just froze in disbelief. The words didn't feel like part of a legal evaluation. They felt like a personal rebuke, raw, angry, and deliberate. A sharp gasp came from the second row. One of the law clerks shifted uneasily. Even Crockett's legal team, well-trained and stoic, seemed momentarily unmoored. A junior associate blinked hard, glancing to see if anyone would object. Reporters in the press row jerked upright, fingers suspended above their laptops. And the court recorder, a veteran of high-profile trials, paused with her hands mid-air, eyes narrowing as if to silently ask, "Did a sitting Supreme Court justice really just say that?" But the most surprising reaction didn't come from the audience, or the stunned attorneys, or the hushed court officials. It came from Jasmine Crockett herself. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't glance toward her team for guidance. Instead, she slowly turned her eyes up to meet the bench and offered something so unexpected that it fractured the tension like glass. She smiled, not mockingly, not in defiance, a simple, knowing smile. Calm, controlled, calculated. It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. The kind that comes when you've seen this play before and have already written the last line. And that line hadn't been spoken yet. Somewhere in the back of the gallery, an older black woman clutched her chest, not from fear, but from the stirring realization that she was watching the beginning of something seismic. It wasn't the case docket that would make headlines, it was the mood, the imbalance of power, the unmasking of bias in real time. The silent judgment from the bench had just turned into a public confrontation. But before another word could be spoken, the screen cut to black. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. When Amy Coney Barrett was sworn in as the youngest woman appointed at the United States Supreme Court, she was hailed by conservatives as a generational force. The intellectual heir to Antonin Scalia's originalist vision, she embodied decades of Republican judicial strategy, polished, unflappable, and cloaked in a robe of moral certainty. Her confirmation hearings had been lightning rods of controversy, but they ended with smiles, Bible quotes, and praise from right-wing circles that treated her appointment as a spiritual victory. For months after, Barrett was presented as incorruptible anchor, an anchor of faith and logic on a polarized bench. But in the years that followed, cracks began to show in that halo. Her rulings began to wobble, firmly conservative one moment, opaque and evasive the next. Legal scholars whispered that her decisions lacked the consistency of Scalia's jurisprudence. To critics on the left, she was an ideologue in disguise. To some on the right, she was too cautious to be dependable. Behind the scenes, the tension was building, and then came the recordings. They were leaked without fanfare, just a clip here, a quote there. Audio from a closed-door legal conference where Barrett spoke candidly about the left's obsession with race narratives. and how the Constitution had been overturpeted to manufacture oppression. The comments, while not explicitly unethical, sent shockwaves through the legal community. This wasn't the cautious, clean jurist from the hearings. This was someone irritated by scrutiny and emboldened by applause in partisan circles. The legal world shifted on its axis. Editorial boards called for an investigation. Judicial watchdog groups filed FOI requests. Even some conservative colleagues expressed discomfort behind closed doors. One retired circuit judge said, "She's not the same justice we confirmed." Yet Barrett refused to acknowledge the growing scrutiny. She doubled down, ignored the noise. When the case of Crockett v. Texas Board of Elections landed on her docket, her clerks quietly recommended recusal. Not due to legal obligation, but to preserve the court's already frayed public trust. But Barrett dismissed their warnings. "I'm not stepping back," she reportedly told them. "This one matters." And those who knew her best understood exactly what that meant. This wasn't about legal precedent. This wasn't about the Constitution. It was about Jasmine Crockett. It was about a young black congresswoman who had once gone on MSNBC and called Barrett's ruling in Dobbs judicially shallow and morally hollow. It was about a woman who had risen not through legacy but through grit. Barrett wasn't just stepping into a courtroom. She was walking into a personal reckoning. Before Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was trending on social media or commanding headlines with her fiery committee cross-examinations, she was just a public defender from Dallas, Texas. Her first clients didn't have campaign donations or lobbyists. They had eviction notices. She built her legal reputation representing the forgotten people whose names were misspelled in police reports, people who didn't have the luxury of due process until Crockett walked into their courtroom. She wasn't just a fighter. She was surgical with the law. And when she transitioned from legal warrior to elected official, that same grit followed her to Washington. By the time she reached Congress, Crockett had already become a symbol, particularly among younger voters and communities of color, for what unapologetic truth-telling in power could look like. Her voice cut through the usual Washington theater. She didn't grandstand. She brought receipts. Viral videos of her grilling MAGA figures during oversight hearings racked up millions of views. But her most significant legal challenge came not in front of a camera, but in front of the Supreme Court. The case was Crockett v. Texas Board of Elections, a direct challenge to the state's sweeping voter suppression law that disproportionately impacted Black and Latino communities. Crockett didn't just file the case. She made it personal. She'd visited polling stations turned away for lack of paperwork. She'd held town halls with 90-year-olds forced to drive 2 hours to vote. Her team compiled thousands of affidavits, hours of footage, and mountains of state memos. This wasn't just about ballots. It was about power. Real, generational, systemic power. And Amy Coney Barrett had already made her opinion known, at least to those who could read between the lines. The tension between Crockett and Barrett wasn't new. A year prior, Crockett had gone on MSNBC and, when asked about Barrett's opinion in Dobbs, didn't mince words. "If a robe hides bias," she said, "it's time to see who's really wearing it." According to Crockett's aides, it never stopped haunting Barrett's chambers. So, when the case reached the court, Crockett's legal team urged caution. "Don't poke the bear," one senior advisor warned. "You already know she's watching you." But Crockett shook her head. "I'm not here to yell. I'm here to expose." She instructed her lawyers to pursue the argument aggressively, to focus not just on statutory overreach, but on the racial implications baked into the law's design. Every brief was sharp, every filing surgical. And when it came time to appear in front of the court, Crockett made a decision most advisors would have called reckless. She insisted on arguing part of the case herself, not as a congresswoman, as a civil rights attorney, standing across from Amy Coney Barrett with nothing but the law and the truth on her side. If Barrett's rise had been one of privilege wrapped in prestige, Crockett's path was forged in fire. Now both stories were about to collide in a courtroom neither of them would leave unchanged. The courtroom was still, too still. A federal judge's entrance usually carried solemnity, but today it dragged a storm. Judge Amy Coney Barrett, cloaked in black robes, perched high on the bench, but her posture betrayed tension. Her fingers tapped the armrush, not with judicial detachment, but with barely masked impatience. The moment she looked up and locked eyes with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a chill fell over the room. "Let the record reflect," Barrett began, her voice icy but sharp, "that this proceeding is not a platform for political performance, despite recent behavior to the contrary." Crockett didn't blink. Seated beside her counsel, she remained composed, hands folded over a thick binder labeled Exhibit D, Voter Impact Reports. Her burgundy blazer stood out in the sea of grays and blacks, unapologetic, like the woman wearing it. Barrett's eyes narrowed. She flipped through her prepared notes, then did something that made the entire courtroom freeze. She pulled out a printed screenshot of a tweet. The gallery stirred. Legal aides whispered. The tweet was from Jasmine Crockett's verified account dated 4 months earlier. "If you write laws to suppress votes, I'll write history that exposes you." That's the deal. Barrett raised the paper high. "This is what you believe qualifies as courtroom decorum?" Objection came fast. Crockett's lawyer, a seasoned civil rights litigator, shot to his feet. "Your Honor, relevance." "Sustained," Barrett snapped before he could finish, slamming the gavel with force that echoed off the marble. "You'll be seated. Now." Reporters stopped typing. Court artist froze mid-sketch. A student from Georgetown Law whispered to her professor, "Is this normal?" The professor only shook her head slowly. "This is personal," Barrett continued, now displaying a printed op-ed Crockett had penned during the confirmation hearings. "You called this institution compromised. You said, let me quote, 'When justice wears a robe stitched with ideology, the law itself becomes threadbare.' Care to explain, Congresswoman?" Crockett's lawyer rose again, more slowly. "Your Honor, I must object again. These remarks are from a public opinion piece, not evidence. This court isn't on trial. Voter disenfranchisement is." But the gavel came down harder. "If you interrupt me one more time, Counselor, I will hold you in contempt." The gallery gasped. Legal scholars in attendance, some of whom had clerked at the Supreme Court, exchanged stunned glances. This wasn't judicial conduct. This was a public undressing, a controlled ambush, a federal bench being used like a political firing squad. Barrett then turned to Crockett directly. "Do you deny these words, or do you consider them part of your legal strategy, undermining the court to elevate your own profile?" Crockett finally looked up and tilted her head, studying the judge with calm calculation. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence said what her team couldn't. "You've shown your hand too soon, Judge." And it was shaking. The courtroom, packed with activists, students, legal reporters, and constitutional scholars, felt like it had slipped into some surreal version of reality, one where the impartial robe had been replaced with a loaded weapon. Behind Barrett, the American flag barely fluttered from the ventilation, but it felt like the ideals it symbolized, fairness, neutrality, justice, had already crumpled under the weight of unchecked power. The attack had begun, but so had the reckoning. For a moment, the courtroom sat in stunned quiet. Judge Barrett's verbal barrage still echoed in the marble walls, the gavel's sharp thuds imprinting more like a warning than a ruling. But when the silence stretched too long, all eyes turned not toward the bench, but toward the woman in burgundy. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett slowly rose from her chair. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look flustered. She carried no notes, no printed rebuttals. Just a slim leather binder she hadn't touched until now. With measured steps, she approached the podium. Her team looked tense, unsure if she would follow their plan or abandon it altogether. Crockett, however, looked like someone walking into a room she had already memorized. "Your Honor," she began softly, "I've been accused this morning of disrespecting this court and undermining its legitimacy. But if I may, I'd like to read into the record some writings, your own." Barrett's jaw visibly tightened. Crockett opened the binder and pulled out a highlighted excerpt. "From your keynote address at the Federalist Society Gala, October 2023, you said, and I quote, 'It is not the role of judges to reflect popular will, but to guard the republic as our founding fathers envisioned it, even if the cost is public outrage." She turned the page. "Then, just 4 months later, in an interview on C-SPAN, you said, and again I quote, 'The Constitution must evolve in application, even if not in language. Our interpretation cannot remain frozen in time.'" The gallery stirred. Crockett held the room with nothing but the rhythm of contradictions. "I'm not a Supreme Court justice," she continued, "but I do know enough about the law to understand that when you claim to be an originalist while simultaneously endorsing selective evolution of interpretation, that's not jurisprudence. That's narrative control." Barrett leaned forward, but Crockett held her ground. "This case is not about me. It's about a state law that disproportionately impacts marginalized voters. I came here with data, with affidavits, with constitutional arguments. But instead, I've been met with personal tweets, op-eds, and tone policing." A reporter dropped his pen. No one moved to pick it up. "You've accused me of making this about politics," Crockett said, her tone still calm, but now sharpened. "But, Your Honor, if there's one person in this room who's brought politics to the bench, it wasn't me. I came with evidence. You came with screenshots." Murmurs rose behind her. Barrett's clerk subtly reached for something on the desk, perhaps to calm his boss, or to signal help. Crockett continued, her voice unwavering. "You've said I disrespected this court, but the public record shows something different. I've challenged decisions. I've challenged precedents, but I've never tried to hijack the bench to silence dissent." Then she paused, just long enough for the weight of her next sentence to settle. "So if we're talking about contempt for this institution, Your Honor, I asked the record to reflect this. I walked into this courtroom with reverence. But the bench greeted me with retribution." Gasps again. But this time, they weren't for the judge. Barrett, momentarily speechless, looked down at her notes, but didn't speak. Crockett calmly closed her binder, took one step back, and stood still. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't flinched. But she had just placed the Constitution between herself and the gavel, and the Constitution had held. The silence after Jasmine Crockett's final sentence was thick, immovable. It hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud that refused to rain. Judge Barrett sat frozen. Her gavel rested just inches from her hand, but she didn't reach for it. Her fingers tapped once against the polished oak of the bench, then again, faster, betraying the tension she was trying to mask. Crockett, still standing, didn't move. She didn't smirk. She didn't grandstand. She let the echo of her words ring in Barrett's courtroom, challenged and unbroken. When Barrett finally did speak, it came with a tremor. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, voice slightly brittle, "this is a court of law, not a theater. You seem to mistake the solemnity of this chamber for a campaign stage." Crockett tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, but in clinical observation. "With respect, Your Honor, I've mistaken nothing, but it seems the line between law and performance blurred the moment you abandoned judicial neutrality." That struck a nerve. Barrett leaned forward now, visibly agitated. "You will not lecture this court." "I don't need to," Crockett answered, voice quiet but clear. "The record is doing that all on its own." Someone in the gallery let out a faint, all but wow. Barrett shot a glance in that direction, but by now she'd lost the room. Even seasoned court reporters weren't typing. They were watching, absorbing. Trying to regain control, Barrett reached for a printed page in front of her and waved it. "Let the record show. This congresswoman publicly questioned my integrity on national television." Crockett didn't even blink. "Yes, I did. And today, unfortunately, you've confirmed why I had to." Barrett raised her gavel, as if ready to call order, but stopped short. Her hand trembled. She set it down instead, slowly, methodically, trying not to show the crack. But the damage wasn't subtle anymore. Crockett's final move was devastating in its restraint. She stepped forward one more time. No binder. No fire. Just a single, deliberate sentence. Your Honor, the only person in this room unqualified to interpret the Constitution may be the one hiding behind the robe to distort it. It hit the gallery like a thunderclap. Half the room gasped. The other half erupted into spontaneous applause, until a bailiff raised his hand signaling decorum. Barrett stood. For a moment it looked like she might shout, but she didn't. She reached for her water, missed the cup on the first try, then composed herself and delivered the only line she could muster. This court is in recess. The gavel finally struck, but the authority behind it had already evaporated. Cameras caught everything: Barrett's flushed face, Crockett's steel calm, the stunned gallery, and the moment a sitting Supreme Court justice couldn't hold the floor against a single Congresswoman, armed only with documentation and dignity. As Barrett exited the bench, her clerks whispering urgently beside her, Crockett remained where she was, rooted like a monument. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't defied procedure. But in the span of minutes, she'd turned the courtroom from a hostile ambush into a public reckoning. The last thing the live stream captured was Barrett's retreat and Crockett's unshaken stance beneath the seal of the United States. The courtroom clip exploded before lunch. By the time the East Coast wrapped its workday, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's quiet rebuke of Justice Amy Coney Barrett had racked up 10 million views across platforms. Not because she shouted, not because she sought, but because, in a room designed to crush dissent, she stood still and told the truth. The image Crockett in a burgundy suit, eyes locked on Barrett's bench, voice unwavering, became an instant icon. One comment read, "She didn't raise her voice, but she raised the bar for every elected official in this country." Hashtags surged. Crockett vs. Barrett trended within the hour, followed by judicial bias and calm in power. Teach-agers clipped the moment for TikTok, splicing Crockett's line, "Calm isn't weakness, it's strength with a spine," over slow motif at its gospel choirs and low-sfi at eats. One video racked up 3 million likes in 48 hours. Teachers downloaded the footage to use in civics classes. Activist groups began quoting Crockett's language in press releases about legal transparency and civil rights. For Gen Z and millennials, she wasn't just a politician. She was the embodiment of power without arrogance. "This is what we've been waiting for," one user posted. Not the loudest person, the clearest one. But it wasn't just online. At a community college in Atlanta, a professor paused his constitutional law lecture to replay the footage 3 times. He told his students, "This is what courtroom control looks like. This is how you argue without apology." At a church in Detroit, the pastor closed his sermon with Crockett's quote, connecting it to Proverbs about soft answers turning away wrath. In veterans forums, former service members shared the clip and commented, "That's how you win a war without lifting a weapon." In a time of performative rage and tribal politics, Jasmine Crockett had delivered a masterclass in composure, and it reverberated far beyond legal circles. The political cartoonists ran with it. One drawing showed Crockett standing beneath a cracked marble bust labeled "Judicial Impartiality," holding nothing but a folder marked "Receipts." Another showed Barrett's bench literally collapsing under the weight of her own contradictions, while Crockett stood still, untouched. Late-night comedians referenced the moment, not to mock but to marvel. She didn't even flinch, and the whole courtroom cracked open. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support. The NAACP called it a rare moment of dignity meeting injustice head-on. Black women's organizations flooded Crockett's office with flowers, letters, and emails thanking her for modeling restraint without submission. One young activist wrote, "You didn't just win a case. You showed every black girl who's been told to stay quiet what dignity can look like when it walks straight into power and doesn't bow." Meanwhile, memes and merch flooded Etsy and Instagram. T-shirts read, "I didn't scream, I just stood." Mugs printed with Crockett's silhouette declared, "Calm is a weapon." A hoodie stitched with her quote sold out in under 12 hours. Artists painted murals in Oakland, Philadelphia, and Houston. One graffiti piece near Howard University read simply, "Respect is earned." Crockett earned it. Perhaps the most surprising reaction came from within legal academia. Law students across the country began dissecting the moment in classroom debates and podcasts. On a Georgetown student forum, one third-year wrote, "For years we were told to defer to the court, but now we're seeing that accountability doesn't mean disrespect it. It means knowing your facts and standing on them." The ripple effect had begun, and the system felt it. For a nation increasingly disillusioned with its institutions, this wasn't just a viral clip. It was a cultural recalibration. The bench wasn't sacred because someone sat on it. It was sacred when someone stood up to it, and still stood tall after the silence fell. By sunrise the next day, Jasmine Crockett's courtroom moment had become the lead story across every major network. On CNN, the headline rolled across the ticker. "Dismantled Judge on live feed." The segment opened with side-by-side footage of the exchange, Barrett's voice trembling, Crockett's face serene. Anchor Aaron Burnett paused after airing it, visibly shaken, before saying, "This was not just a legal exchange. This was an institutional reckoning." Ms. NBC brought on constitutional scholars, psychologists, and political strategists. One roundtable panelist said bluntly, "Jasmine Crockett did in 2 minutes what most Democratic leadership couldn't do in 2 years. Command respect, without ever raising her voice." Rachel Maddow called it a moment of surgical precision, and aired a montage of Crockett's previous congressional showdowns to show how this moment wasn't luck. It was training, it was strategy, and it was earned. Even NPR, usually understated in tone, broke protocol with a special segment titled "Grace on the Record, Crockett and the Power of Calm." The host replayed the moment without commentary, just silence after Crockett's final line, letting the tension breathe. Then came the quote from a former federal judge, "I've never seen a sitting Supreme Court justice lose composure like that." Barrett didn't just lose the argument, she lost the bench. But the real surprise came from across the aisle. Fox News initially attempted a deflection. "Activist Congresswoman disrespects the court," read one chyron. But that narrative didn't hold. The full clip showed no shouting, no interruption, only a methodical deconstruction of Barrett's own words. Laura Ingraham tried to spin it as a stunt, but even some conservative legal commentators pushed back. Judge Jeanine Pirro admitted on air, "You might not agree with her politics, but Congresswoman Crockett conducted herself with more discipline than I've seen from most attorneys in that courtroom." That clip was clipped and circulated immediately. Fox News' own panelists inadvertently adding fuel to Crockett's rise. Legal journals scrambled to issue statements. "A case study in judicial ethics," wrote the Yale Law Review. Harvard Law's blog published a viral piece. The Day, the gavel cracked, penned by a second-year student who wrote, "Justice Barrett wielded power like a sword, Crockett treated it like a mirror, and the reflection was damning." The Atlantic called it the public fracturing of judicial decorum, while Politico ran an editorial. Print media followed suit. New York Times ran a full-page piece in the Sunday Review, quoting courtroom witnesses who said Barrett looked rattled and off her axis. One legal analyst described it as the closest thing to a televised unraveling of judicial credibility in modern history. Meanwhile, the Washington Post dug deeper, publishing an exposé on Barrett's partisan appearances in recent months. "The threads were loose before Crockett walked into that courtroom," the article stated. "She just knew where to pull." But it wasn't all commentary. It impact. Polls conducted 48 hours after the hearing showed a stunning 18-point spike in Jasmine Crockett's national approval rating among independent voters. Among young men aged 18-35, her name recognition jumped 40%. A poll by Pew Research noted that 1 in 4 respondents said the incident made them reconsider the unchecked power of the Supreme Court. Another asked, "Do you believe Supreme Court justices should be held accountable publicly?" The answer, 82%. Yes. The moment had become more than a moment. It was now a media earthquake, reconfiguring the national conversation. Overnight, what started as a courtroom hearing became a symbol of generational change, judicial accountability, and a different kind of leadership. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was calm, factual, and devastating. And in that silence, a new voice had risen, not by drowning others out, but by exposing how shaky the loudest ones had become. Within 24 hours of the courtroom live stream, the tremors had reached the legal system itself. Judicial watchdog groups, usually quiet, reserved bodies, released urgent statements demanding a formal ethics review of Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The Center for Judicial Accountability wrote, "What we witnessed was not the impartiality expected of a sitting justice. It was personal bias delivered from the bench." The American Bar Association issued a rare call for the Senate Judiciary Committee to consider reopening inquiries into Supreme Court ethics, citing Crockett's exchange as a red flag event. Then came the leaks. Former law clerks, once loyal to Barrett, broke ranks. Anonymous emails were shared with The Intercept and ProPublica showing internal unrest. One former clerk wrote, "She lost her objectivity months ago. We raised concerns about her speeches, her tone. We were told to stay quiet." Another confirmed there were internal memos warning her not to preside over cases involving active lawmakers. But Barrett had insisted. She said it would restore faith in the court. But she walked in ready to prove a point, not hear a case, one leak read. And the legal community wasn't silent. Prominent professors at Yale, Columbia, and Stanford published open letters. "The Supreme Court must be held to its own standards," one read. "Justice Barrett did not simply err, she compromised the integrity of the bench." A former appellate judge stated on PBS, "It was like watching a teacher argue with a student and lose. If she can't maintain composure, how can she maintain authority?" Barrett's office initially declined all media requests. Then, suddenly, she canceled 2 upcoming university lectures and a planned keynote at the Federalist Society's annual legal summit. No explanation. Just vanished from the docket. Her silence only added to the momentum. Meanwhile, Crockett's stock soared within legal circles. Harvard Law invited her to deliver the opening address at their upcoming Legal Impact Symposium. Yale followed with an invitation to deliver the Kaplan Lecture, an honor usually reserved for retired justices or Nobel laureates. At NYU, law students began planning a panel titled "The Crockett Doctrine: Advocacy in the Age of Institutional Power." The idea? To explore how calm, documented counter-argument could hold more weight than traditional courtroom theatrics. Inside the Beltway, conversations turned strategic. Democratic National Committee leadership began floating Crockett's name as a national legal treasure. One email leak showed a prominent donor suggesting she chair the next Judiciary Subcommittee on Voting Rights. A memo circulated internally among DNC brass read, "She's not just a lawyer. She's a movement." But the most unexpected development came from within the judiciary. Several federal judges, quietly but firmly, began circulating a recommendation that Justice Barrett recuse herself permanently from all future voting rights cases. One judge told The New Yorker, "The credibility of our institution depends on restraint." She showed none. The argument was simple. Barrett's outburst had made it impossible for her to be perceived as impartial on matters directly affecting democratic access. It wasn't about political leanings anymore. It was about optics, ethics, and precedent. Social media amplified this ripple into a wave. Hashtags like "Recuse Barrett" and "Ethics as Matter" trended alongside Crockett Doctrine. Civil rights organizations like the ACLU and Brennan Center released joint statements calling for structural court reforms, using Barrett's moment as Exhibit A. "What happened in that courtroom," one statement read, "is why the American people no longer trust the highest bench." Even some conservative legal minds, off the record, admitted concern. "She let it get personal," said one anonymous federal prosecutor. "That's not supposed to happen in robes." Jasmine Crockett never gloated. When asked by a New York Times reporter if she had anything to say to Barrett in hindsight, she replied, "Only this: public service is about composure under pressure." If that's gone, it's time to step back. By week's end, one thing had become clear. This was no longer just about one hearing. This was about the reckoning of judicial credibility in the digital age, and the Congresswoman who forced the system to confront itself, without ever raising her voice. They came in waves. Not just the media commentators or legal analysts, but artists, educators, and ordinary citizens who had never watched a courtroom proceeding in their lives. Within 48 hours, Jasmine Crockett's quiet dismantling of Judge Barrett's authority had become more than a political moment. It was cultural canon. Charges were printed overnight with phrases like, "I didn't yell, I documented and judged the judge." Etsy storefronts lit up with coffee mugs, stickers, and posters capturing Crockett's composed stare mid-cross, framed with her viral quote. Sometimes the most powerful gavel is truth. University professors in law schools, from Stanford to Georgetown, emailed one another frantically, planning to integrate the footage into next semester's curriculum on constitutional ethics. One professor tweeted, "This is the gold standard of courtroom poise and legal preparedness. No drama, just demolition." Even in high schools, civic studies teachers used the exchange to explore checks and balances, judicial integrity, and advocacy through evidence. Then came Oprah. She posted a 45-second clip on her Instagram with the caption, "This is Grace under siege." In less than 3 hours, it hit 9 million views. Ava DuVernay retweeted it with one word: leadership. Black women's organizations across the country released joint statements praising Crockett for modeling strength without antagonism, fire without brilliance, without bravado. One advocacy group said, "It wasn't just what she said, it was how she refused to stoop to the disrespect hurled at her." Barrett's words had tried to paint Crockett as combative. But in the contrast of silence, the world saw something else: resolve that didn't need volume to carry. A former Marine veteran commented under one of the viral clips, "That's how you win a war without lifting a weapon." She left the judge defenseless with nothing but facts. TikTok trends followed, law students reenacting the courtroom scene to dramatic soundtracks. Instagram Reels dissected the legal brilliance of Crockett's cross. Even comedy skits emerged, portraying fictional judges trying and failing to regain control of a courtroom against a Crockett-style takedown. But amidst the memes, the merchandise, and the media frenzy, one sentiment emerged stronger than the rest. People felt seen. For every woman who had ever been told to calm down, for every activist ever silenced for being too loud, for every young lawyer ever underestimated, this moment was fuel. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just survived a judicial attack, she had transformed it into a cultural blueprint. And in doing so, she reminded the country, dignity isn't weakness, it's the sharpest sword in the arsenal. The backlash came swiftly, but not for Jasmine Crockett. Conservative circles exploded with fury, branding her dangerous, insubordinate, and a threat to judicial order. One Republican strategist told Fox News, "This is what happens when you let activists into Congress. They think they can cross-examine a Supreme Court justice like it's a debate club." But even some on the right were hesitant to defend Barrett's behavior. Behind closed doors, a few GOP aides admitted the judge's tone was unhinged and personal in a way that left her exposed. Meanwhile, Crockett's stock skyrocketed. DNC officials, previously hesitant to spotlight firebrand newcomers, began floating her name in every strategy meeting. "She didn't raise her voice, but she raised the bar," one senior advisor said. Liberal PACs flooded her inbox with offers of support, and her campaign war chest saw a 220% donation surge within 5 days. New York donors called. California donors booked fundraisers. Swing state organizers added her to their midterm tour wish list. MSNBC ran a special segment titled Jasmine Crockett, Presidential Temperament, with polling data showing 58% of viewers believed she displayed the calm, clarity, and command expected of a national leader. Social media exploded with speculative hashtags, Crockett 2008. One commentator quipped, "The judge tried to end her credibility, instead she launched her future." Barrett, on the other hand, faced internal pressure. Judicial review boards began informal inquiries, and legal scholars penned op-eds questioning whether her open hostility had breached judicial ethics. The American Bar Association issued a rare Even some of Barrett's allies began to distance themselves. A few Federalist Society members expressed concern that the incident had provided ammunition to those already skeptical of judicial neutrality. Barrett canceled a scheduled appearance at the University of Notre Dame and went silent on social media. A week later, her office released a brief statement insisting her courtroom conduct reflected the gravity of the constitutional questions at hand. But by then, the damage was done. Whispers of long-term consequences echoed through Washington. One Democratic senator remarked off-camera, If you wanted a moment that clarified who's ready to lead and who's lost the thread of public service, you just got it. What began as a courtroom clash had become a referendum on temperament, truth, and trust. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just defended democracy, she'd exposed the fragility of the bench that was meant to guard it. In a courtroom built on centuries of tradition, where robes are meant to carry the weight of impartiality, something extraordinary happened. Not because someone yelled, not because someone stormed out, but because one woman chose to remain calm while the system tried to shake her. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She reminded America what leadership looks like when it's under attack. While Judge Coney Barrett let personal bias slip through the cracks of her black robe, Crockett held steady, with documents, with precedent, with composure. She didn't have to match volume for volume. She had receipts, and that was louder than any gavel. This wasn't just about one courtroom. It wasn't just about one judge or one case. It was about who we are when power tries to silence truth. It was about every woman who's been talked over, every voter who's been told their voice doesn't count, every person who's ever been underestimated and told to know their place. Crockett's moment was more than a confrontation. It was a correction, a recalibration of what justice should feel like when the cameras are rolling and the stakes are national. She didn't shout. She exposed. And in doing so, she gave America something rare, a moment of truth delivered with surgical calm. Now the question is, what will we do with that moment? Will we let it pass, or will we amplify it? Will we move on, or will we move forward? With her. If this video moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more unfiltered political confrontations and courtroom truth-telling. Comment below. What was your reaction when Judge Barrett cracked? Share this with someone who believes in calm power and real justice. Join the conversation on X, TikTok, and Instagram using Crockett v. Barrett and @CalmIsPower. This isn't just political debate. This is a new standard for how it's done, and it starts with you.